morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth event in our series focusing on regenerative housing. This series was born out of my interest in really elevating the discussion around affordable and social housing here in Australia, in the hopes that the very best of thinking in sustainable and regenerative design can become an everyday consideration when we think about how to design for those most vulnerable within our communities. I would first like to start by humbly acknowledging that I'm meeting with you from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them deeply for their continuing care and custodianship of this land and waters on which I work, play, walk and call home. I would also like to extend this respect to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders who are on the call with us today. I will be hosting with you today along with our wonderful speakers, and I'd like to start by inviting you to say hi in the chat box below and let us know which land you're calling in from. And I'd like to welcome you to participating with us in the session today. There will be a facilitated discussion after the three speakers have shared their perspectives, and we would love you to participate from your desks or homes or wherever you may be. If you have any burning questions that arise for you during the presentations, please use the Q&A function that you'll see below and add them in there rather than the chat function. Okay, so I'm Claire Bowles and I'm the Sustainability Lead for i2C Architects. I work with our teams and clients to build capacity and find ways to design better buildings that positively influence the way we are in the world. I'm a firm believer that every decision we make and the way that we interact with each other and the way that we design can ensure that we're working towards being the best ancestors for our future generations. I'm really pleased to be here this morning with you, sharing a cuppa and taking some time to listen, learn and converse on a much needed discussion. I'm grateful to be here and to feel into a conversation which is close to my heart. As a white female speaking from a place of privilege, I'm very conscious that colonialism has existed and continues to exist in the systems and hearts, hands and minds of so many, and is embedded and core to our capitalist system of extraction and infinite growth. Today, we ask what it will take to decolonize our hearts, hands and minds and make a shift towards a relocalized, compassionate, regenerative way of life that holds life sacred and embraces community. Housing is a fundamental aspect of the way we are and how we live in community. We will explore how a profound paradigm shift is required to decolonize our futures and manifest thriving, dignified and flourishing lives for all. So it's with great pleasure that I invite our first panel member, Yin Paradise. Professor Yin Paradise is a Wakaya man who is chair in race relations at Deakin University. He conducts research on the health and social and economic effects of racism, as well as anti-racism theory, policy and practice across diverse settings, including online, in workplaces, schools, universities, housing, the arts and health. He also teaches and undertakes research in Indigenous knowledges and decolonisation. I've been reading Yin's work with real admiration, and I'm looking forward to his Decolonising Futures workshop this Sunday, which he may like to share after he's finished offering up his perspective with us today. And over to you, Yin. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So yeah, I'm going to whip through a presentation. Might be slightly more slides than strictly necessary for the minute time that I have allotted. This is the title of the presentation, which comes from this paper, which you can download freely online. I'm sure this PowerPoint will be available afterwards. Basically, the paper is about the problems of modernity and decolonial solutions to those problems, and I outline some of the probably quite well known but not often discussed shocking statistics of modernity, the kind of world that we live in essentially, where Indigenous people continue to be oppressed and assimilated and exterminated, where most people don't have enough for their own needs, and a small minority of people have far too much, far more than they need. That's the general gist of it. And we are familiar with these sort of statistics. 8 men are wealthier than half the world's population. 1.6 billion people are without adequate housing. A quarter of children worldwide are malnourished. These sort of truths of modernity go along, of course, with increasing securitization, conflict on a global scale, and resource declines, and biosystem and ecosystem limits being exceeded all over the world. Climate change, mass extinction, those sorts of things. And really, we're not sure, there's no real evidence of political will to do anything about it at the moment. I mean, there's some great targets that have been introduced lately of carbon neutral targets for the mid-century region of time. But, recent reports show that there's been no progress towards these sort of targets over the last 20 years. So modernity, I'll define what I mean by that essentially, but the history of it is accelerated and intensified over the last 500 years. We've seen private property being created all over the world, from colonisation, from enclosure of lands in Europe. We've seen capturing the means of production by a wealthy few, and this constant accelerating extraction of resources and stagnating real wages over the last 50 years is the sort of truths of modernity that we need to grapple with if we want to change direction going forward. Another aspect of modernity, of course, are nation states. They've been around for thousands of years in their earliest forms, but more recently, once again, in the last few hundred years, have taken over the earth. So essentially, what I'm suggesting is modernity is about, in general, is about debt. It's about private property, institutions, nation states. Those are the four main aspects of modernity, and many of those have great relevance to housing. So, nation states are not necessarily good for us. We could probably do without them. They are part of the aspects of modernity that benefit the few and not the many. And they're based on this idea that people need to be protected from ourselves, which I take great issue with. So decolonial futures are about moving beyond debt, property, institution, nation states to really consider and grapple with the radical alienation that we have from ourselves, from each other, from other life, often from our work for many of us, and from what we rudely call nature, which is not something separate from us at all, but part of us. Some of the aspects to reconsider, I would suggest, are things like rationality, universalism, the idea of separability, certainty, control, mastery, progress, merit, entitlement, duty, and sacrifice as defining core values of the societies that we live in now. And what other ways of knowing, being, and doing are there beyond this idea of extraction, infinite growth, consumption, and human exceptionalism, the idea that humans are somehow special and different from other animals and plants and life. So my suggestion is to radically relocalise, to build community, to grow, to foster local communities. And there's many ways to do that. Mostly it's about engaging with people that we live with on this world in ways that are not competitive, that are actually cooperative. Many specific ways of doing that, some of them very relevant to housing. So I'm suggesting rejecting ideals of competitive success, living slowly with pleasure in frugality, simplicity, and sufficiency. And these are specific ideas for moving forward with that. And so more here, acting locally, thinking globally is important in the interconnected world. And it is very much interconnected and interdependent. We're all vulnerable to those relations that we have and are empowered by them at the same time. So, some more ideas for challenging the system, the oppressive system that we live in at the moment, the colonial system, the colonial state system, also reducing our impact on the planet, and thinking about specifics of how our system works. So I mentioned debt, property, institutions, but there's more. There's interest, there's banking, obviously fossil fuel subsidies, the damage of speculative construction in housing sectors. Planned obsolescence is a huge problem. For example, if we made mobile phones to last as long as we could, we would use 70% less mobile phones than we do. And they are made with some very damaging resource extraction methods. Redundant trade, tax breaks, there's so many things wrong, and there's many ways to focus on aspects of the system while keeping a broader view of how it works generally. So in summary, I'm suggesting that we need to pivot towards societies that are more about self-realisation, freedom, interdependence, care, vulnerability. Certainly the commons needs to be very much cultivated and nourished. Multi-scaled cooperation outside the deeply hierarchical nature of the many institutions that we have. And we need to work towards largely egalitarian networks of small-scale communities. So I'm talking about things like degrowth, rewilding, permaculture, and drawing a lot from Indigenous cultures and values to create different lives to the lives of many people experience in the world today. And I'll leave you with this diagram, which captures a lot of what I've been talking about, not necessarily the details of how, but some of the goals of what a profound shift, a radical shift from an extractive to a regenerative economy looks like. And the key aspects of that are different values, the move from the drawing down, as they say, of power, of resources, of decision-making to the local, and the move from hierarchies to deep democracy, cooperation, and a focus on caring, compassionate, cooperative communities as opposed to what we have now. Thanks.
Thank you, Yin. That was wonderful and wonderfully to time. Whilst you didn't give us the steps of the how, I think once we have the caring and sacredness within us, the how will come. Beautiful. I would next like to invite Margaret. So Margaret Foe is a Shimsian from the Eagle clan of the, now forget me if I pronounce this wrong, the Gitgart First Nation. She joined the non-profit housing sector 25 years ago and has been the CEO of Aboriginal Housing Association for 3 years. Margaret's career has been built on her dedication to serve and support the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia, and she currently serves on both the CHRA's Board of Directors and the Indigenous Housing Advisory Caucus. Her dedication to AHMA propelled her from president to director and now welcomes in her 3rd year as CEO. Taking her lead, AHMA partnered with the Government of British Columbia to create the historic Building BC Indigenous Housing Fund. Margaret has played an avidly influential role and actively participates on the national and international housing level. In 2019, she was a keynote speaker and panelist at the 2019 National Housing Conference in Darwin, Australia. Margaret was also part of a nationwide coalition with the United Nations Special Rapporteur to the Right to Adequate Housing. I was kindly introduced to Margaret through Wendy Hayhurst at Community Housing Industry Australia. So I would just like to thank Wendy as well for having Margaret here with us. And I'd like to pass over to you, Margaret.
And thank you, Claire. Before I go into things, I'd like to say thank you, Yin, for your very thoughtful presentation. It once again demonstrates that we are more alike than we are different. Despite the fact we're on opposite sides of the world. And I'd like to quote Elder Helen from Darwin when I was there. She said to us in her opening speech that united we stand, divided we fall. And once we realize that we have more alike than we are apart, we'll actually accomplish many, many more things. So thank you for your thoughtful presentation, Yin. The other thing I want to start off with before I go into my formal presentation is a quote that I had shared with this panel earlier that said, "The colonized minds hear ours and think possession. Decolonizing minds hear ours and feel connection." And I prefer to actually extend that to feel a sense of belonging in the entire world. So kind of fits well with some of Yin's sentiments. So, okay, I'm gonna try and do my share screen. Okay, so again, Ni'it everyone, my name is Margaret Foe. I am Tsimshian. I'm a member of the Lakwalams band in Port Simpson, British Columbia, but I descend from the Gitgat Nation in Hartley Bay and a member of the Eagle Clan. I come to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories and elders present and past of the Torres Strait Islander peoples. It is an honor to continue Alma's connection and to gather with you all today. So I know that Claire gave you a brief overview of who our organization is. I'd like to just start by summarizing that we're a grassroots organization. We're founded in the principles of self-determination, as outlined in the United Declaration on the Rights to Indigenous Peoples. And as urban Indigenous peoples, we do not cede our rights because systemic racism has disenfranchised us. Here in Canada, from the 3 distinction-based groups. So quite often our federal governments and our provincial governments and even our municipal governments like to fall back on the safety of UNDRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that were committed here in Canada to mean the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis, and rightfully so. But what has failed to be recognized here in Canada and across the world is the realization that the colonial systemic structures that settled Canada resulted in a huge disenfranchisement of up to 70 to 80% of our Indigenous peoples from those 3 spectrums into the urban, rural, and northern communities that are not connected to First Nations traditional reserves here in Canada, the traditional Métis nations, nor the Inuit nations that government likes to fall back to. And so we came together as a grassroots organization back in the 1990s to really give voice to the urban Indigenous peoples, to recognize for our disenfranchised peoples that they are not going to have their needs and their ability to create a sense of equity at the table without a unified voice. And so the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in BC came together and was somewhat modeled after the Aboriginal Housing Office in New South Wales, which is where I also met Wendy Hayhurst at a national conference here in Canada. We are the first of our kind here in Canada, and we continue to lead by giving voice to our communities. We are structured with an arm's length board of directors, which means that we have a fully independent board of directors that governs our day-to-day leadership. But we also have a unique structure in a governance body called the Natsamat Lalem Committee, which means one house, one home, no, one heart, one home, sorry. And that means that we have a 3-person elected committee that is nominated from our existing 41 members to ensure that our organization never fails to give voice to the communities, the experts in the field. We recognize at AMA that we in our offices cannot solve the community's problems. We need to have a voice and a vehicle for the community to help drive our strategic plans, to drive our activities, and to drive our objectives. So we're pretty proud of our structure. I know when we have our discussions with our fellows within Australia and New Zealand, there's a lot of interest in how do we create these kind of grassroots organization that have the professional infrastructure to deliver business, yet keep the grassroots connection so that it is by the people for the people. I think it's important as well. I was at a conference called the International Initiative on Mental Health Leadership in 2012, but the year before in 2011, they had a conference in San Francisco where they founded a new group called the Whaareta Group, largely spearheaded from our brothers and sisters in New Zealand. And they started it with a quote that indicated that in any part of the world where colonization occurred, Indigenous peoples rank the highest on the worst scales. And we all know what that means: poverty, homelessness, incarceration, and on and on. And understanding the intergenerational impacts of colonization and the steps that are needed towards decolonization and how this impact the urban, rural, and northern communities and how they form a unique, distinct representation for us here in Canada. That's a distinct representation from the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, as I said earlier, that governments often like to fall back to. I prefer to use the word decolonization over reconciliation, as there can be no true and meaningful reconciliation without overt steps, without actions to decolonize oneself and one's country. Full stop. There is no reconciliation without action. For us, decolonization means that there is nothing about us without us. And we're working here in British Columbia and across Canada for an equal seat at the decision-making table, not only as partners with BC Housing, who have been fantastic, but to be an equal in the decision-making and the distribution of the funds that come for urban Indigenous housing. And despite the fact that we have that good relationship with the province of BC, as Claire said in my introduction, the reality is decolonization of government means that government needs to give up a little bit of their power and truly empower our organization with the decision-making tools and the distribution tools to support our urban Indigenous providers across the province and ideally across the country of Canada. What I often tell government, hiring Indigenous staff, doing consultations and research, and then doing things the same way government has always done it, is not reconciliation. As a first in Canada and a member of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, which is where I met Wendy Hayhurst, and their Indigenous caucus, we created a national recommendation called For Indigenous, by Indigenous, which is also being closely mirrored by our First Nations partners at the Assembly of First Nations here in British Columbia, who are calling it By First Nations, for First Nations. And I think it's important to note too, Leilani Farha had made a comment as she was leaving as UN Special Rapporteur. She said that government likes to act at best from a perspective of benevolence. So the crux of position for us is that true change empowers our Indigenous leaders to affect change for ourselves. Full stop. Not by government for Indigenous people, but by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. So, you know, one of the things that I've always said, both when I talk with UN Special Rapporteur at a national scale and when I talk here in British Columbia, the one thing that we've known for sure, COVID has highlighted the very growing disparities for our most vulnerable populations, and nothing more evident so than for our urban Indigenous peoples. So for us, when we start taking a look at what it means to decolonize our government, both provincially and federally, and even internationally from a housing perspective, it's about taking a look at the post-pandemic world and the colonial challenges that we need to face going forward. And what has been highlighted for us in no uncertain terms here in British Columbia and across Canada has been the reality that COVID has exacerbated those disparities. Most particular with urban Indigenous children and youth. We find that youth that have been apprehended and into foster care are reaping the worst of the benefits in terms of what COVID has done to our community, as well as our women. As you know, we have a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report that was released last year, and yet we have yet to see any investment to help mitigate the ongoing risk and vulnerability of our Indigenous women. And then, of course, finally, the inclusion of a national housing strategy that is led by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. So I'm going to leave you here with the recognition that true decolonization means the systemic dismantling of our colonial constructs and giving real power to effect change to Indigenous leaders. I worked with Senator Sinclair last year, who was one of the chief underwriters of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Canada, and he acknowledged outright that they failed to address urban Indigenous communities. So to close this gap, we need to have urban Indigenous leaders holding an equal seat at the decision and funding tables across the country, and in fact, across the world. Toyak Sim, thank you all.
Thank you, Margaret. That was fantastic. And there are a few things there that really resonated with me and I've jotted down, especially that no true reconciliation without action to decolonize self first. And next, I would like to introduce Louise Crabtree. Louise is an associate professor at the Institute of Society and Culture. Louise's research focuses on social, ecological, and economic sustainability of community-driven housing developments in Australia, on the uptake of housing innovation in practice and policy, on complex adaptive systems theories in urban contexts, and on the interfaces between sustainability, property rights, institutional design, and democracy. Her work is underpinning the emergence of forms of permanently affordable and community-led housing in Australia, such as housing cooperatives and community land trusts, on which she is Australia's leading expert. Louise and I recently met via Zoom as part of a working group established by Jason Twill, so I thank him for this. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks, Claire, and I just want to start with acknowledging that I'm coming in today from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and just want to pass on my acknowledgements of elders past, present and emerging, and also this wonderful country that I feel incredibly privileged to be living and working on. Okay, so what I'm going to go through in this sort of few minutes is some things that resonate, I guess, with things that Yin was saying, but also that start to talk about some of the practicalities of how we might actually do things differently, particularly with regards to housing and its role in starting to decolonise country and thinking and institutions. So firstly, what I'm going to go through is the really deeply colonial role and legacy of property. So Yin sort of flagged the enclosures of the commons and the advent of private property. And what really underpins that in dominant Western models of property is this idea of exclusive possession as a really fundamental and largely unchallenged relationship, and as an idea that seems to be unquestionable. So it's this sort of encoding of fundamental relationship of the idea of ownership. You know, I own this or you own that, which doesn't get questioned. It's sort of seen as natural, I guess. And so it's sort of understood, it's this relationship of ownership, understood as a right to exclude others, and of an understanding of land and property as things that can be owned, and also particular understandings of things like progress and value. So progress is assumed to be linear. There's a tendency to devalue the past, and also a sort of unspoken or sometimes really explicit expectation of future gain. There's sometimes a sort of bizarre flip in that, this sort of flipping between devaluing and romanticising the past. But it's very much a dislocation from the here and now, and this idea of being on a linear progress narrative, I guess, which is really fundamental here. And that sort of underpins this idea of value and the increase of value. And value here is assumed to mean exchange value rather than use value. So it's a sort of focus on what someone else would be prepared to pay for something rather than the value of actually using something, engaging with something, being in relationship. So this sort of constellation of worldviews really sets the ground for exploitative and harmful practices, including speculation and competition over something as fundamental as shelter, when we see this ownership narrative translating into how we occupy place and how we actually construct housing. But more significantly, it actually renders other forms of relationships or ways of being in the world invisible. So, we've seen this really brutally in colonisation, where other modes of occupying place and being in place are really seen as invisible by colonising forces because of this logic of ownership and exclusive possession. And it very much reflects and fosters a disconnection between people, things and places as the fundamental sort of basis of that practice. So if we flip it then and start to unpack this sort of taken for granted nature of ownership, and embrace the inherently relational nature of property, we can understand it as a bundle of rights and responsibilities. And once we do that, that actually enables us to unpack it and decide which of these we want to prioritise. So what relationships, what rights, what responsibilities, what do we want property to do? So how can we do this? So we can think about, well, whose interests and well-being are being affected? by this relationship, by this encoding. We can then look at legal instruments that can balance the rights and responsibilities of those affected, and that might include other generations and other species. So it allows us to think more broadly about who's impacted by particular enactments of property. So then we can really focus on things like, we can clearly and collaboratively identify the objectives that we want to pursue, but then have flexibility within that. So it can change over time, but not to the extent that it loses sight of those objectives that people have agreed to. And obviously this resonates with literature and practice on resilience thinking, which really focuses on the need for vision, trust, communication, and iterative learning. So being in dialogue around, well, what do we want to be doing? What do we need to be achieving? How do we do that? How do we stick to that? And how do we do it as circumstances change? So it really foregrounds relationships that are non-extractive and non-exploitative, and opens up the space to do that because you're talking about property as a set of relationships rather than a static and unquestioned thing. So how do we then do that in terms of practicality? So the work that we've been doing, we've been looking at the use of leases or deeds, and then you can draft those according to your context and aspirations. So that could be things around who's responsible for what repairs and maintenance or rates and insurance, if equity is invested, and if so, how the value of that is calculated over time. So these are all reflective of the sorts of things that you want to embody through your housing and those relationships. You can think about inheritance, you can think about appropriate use. So all of these can be reconfigured towards things that are regenerative and that start to decolonise both place and our minds. And more, for me, where things can get really interesting is that you can actually dislocate ownership from the property. So it might be of a share of a joint organisation, and that share can confer the right to reside in a property. So you can move around over the course of your life as things change. And it's actually making central the relationship with other people in the joint stewardship of place rather than your exclusive ownership of a piece of dirt, if that can even be a thing. And then the organisational culture and constitution can then specify those ethics around stewardship, perpetuity, regenerative practice. So you've got your core aim there, and then you've got a flexible instrument that you can use to actually achieve those aims. So the model isn't the objective. The model is the tool to achieve that clearly specified objective. So some of the work that we did with Aboriginal housing organisations and peak bodies, and obviously this has a replicability and applicability across our housing system more broadly, which dearly needs this. So the first step is who can decide, who has the right to speak for place, who are we when we talk about what we want to achieve. On the basis of that, what are our community and household aspirations? Do we need a new program? Have we, as an organisation, got the capacity to do this? What's our health check? What's our current stock? Is it appropriate? Do we now need new program elements? And then on the back of that, you work out your policy, tenure and legal settings. So if you think about dominant practice, it sort of focuses on point 7 as though that's the be-all and end-all. So this is really showing, now that's just your toolkit. You know, you've got to do all of this other stuff to actually unpack what it is that property is doing and how you can use it to achieve more healing and regenerative outcomes. And then on the very last, design objectives and costs in light of all of that. And so this was sort of a schematic that we drew up to help unpack this and sort of talk about it and the ways it can play around with all of these variables on a sliding scale. The main reason I put this up, though, is to show the role of language in this, because the names that were suggested had nothing to do with ownership. And the way we talk about the occupant of the house is as a resident. So we're getting beyond a language of, is this owning, is this renting? Do we call people tenants? So stepping into a different space where it's about relationality. The person is a resident, or they can be a member, or they can be, you can use these different ways of talking about the relationships that are bound up here and foregrounding those rather than defaulting to these unquestioned and really quite problematic alignments of features. So I will leave off there, and there's a couple of sort of open source things that you can read about it. The really funny thing about that first one, if you want to think about what sorts of mud this can stir up, when that piece came out in the conversation, it actually got picked up by Breitbart, and they wrote a hate piece about me. So it really does seem to rock some boats if you start to ask questions about the things that are taken for granted in property. But we dearly need to do that if we're going to move into healing and regenerative futures. So I'll stop my share there.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for your considered rocking of boats and continuing work in this area, which is much needed. I especially liked you talking about the dislocation of ownership for properties and that idea of joint stewardship in place. That's exactly what we need. And I'd like to move on by introducing Ben. Ben Preston has been involved in a wide range of roles and projects at the forefront of sustainable design and development across the UK, Australia and New Zealand at community and building scale. An Ulster man now living in Aotearoa, he has and continues to walk a long, winding path to understand his own complex relationship to colonialism, the ways it affects his life and leads him to affect the lives of others, and his responsibility to keep walking. Ben was a spark of energy for me that reignited my will and determination to walk this path and to re-engage in the world of sustainability and regeneration here in Melbourne. And I thank him deeply for that. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, huich, folks, and thank you, Claire, for that lovely intro. That's really a lovely reminder of our connection and where we came from and the path we've walked together back in my time in Melbourne. I'd like to just start off by acknowledging that I'm coming to you not from the lands that my ancestors lived on and emerged from, but from the lands of Ngāti Toa and Te Atiawa, Wellington, Poneke. And also just bring in my own sort of history and past as an Ulsterman and somebody who has to this day a strong connection to the Mourne Mountains and the waters of Belfast Lough and the Irish Sea, where the lands that I emerged from and that my ancestors still have and will remain connected to. And I just want to thank Louise, Yin and Margaret. It's a real privilege and honor to be here and to be able to be a part of this complex conversation and very necessary conversation. And I took so much from each of your presentations and perspectives. I really appreciate Margaret shared just before we started that it seems that there's always more that connects us than separates us. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. There's a lot across that despite the different cultures and backgrounds that we're all from. And I kind of want to start with, it really echoes bits of what all of you shared, but very much Yin, your description of modernity and the way that it kind of interacts with us and works through us. And then Louise, your description at the end of the role of language in this. I had an experience recently. I'm working on a project called How We Live, which is exploring the housing sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And through that project, recently had a reviewer on board, Jade Kake, who is an amazing Māori architect doing work up in Whangarei, north of Auckland. And Jade pointed out in a review comment, the way that I had used the word decolonising in part of the original draft text for that document was effectively using it as a metaphor. And it made me realize the way that despite the work that I have done to try and reckon with the way that colonialism works through me and has shaped me, it's still working through me every single day and every single moment, as it is through all of us. And I guess curious to hear, with respect, I guess, Yin, maybe we'll start with you just with reference to what you shared about modernity, and also I heard a little bit in there about your work with anti-racism, and I'm curious for each of your reflections on how and in what ways each of us working in this space can be aware of how those systems work through us and work in anti-racist and anti-colonial ways as we practice.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think there's a great deal of ongoing reflection to do about this, the tuck and yang call to move beyond decolonisation as a metaphor. And it's really about, as Margaret said, decolonising ourselves, our heart, hands and our minds. And it's action, as she also said. I mean, it's questioning the sort of values that Louise has gone into more depth in relation to property, for example. Why do we need to own property? Do we actually think it's okay for people to inherit property from others? I don't think it is at all. I don't think we should own property. I don't think we should inherit property. We question the unquestionable. That's what decolonisation is. It's going deep and saying, why do we do things this way? Why do we have interest? What is interest anyway? It makes no sense. Why would you need to make money from money? What's the benefit there? What are you getting out of that? Why should I pay you money? If you lend me your lawnmower, do you expect me to give you a baby lawnmower back with your lawnmower? No, you just get your lawnmower back. That's it. So forget about this interest bullshit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it requires a certain amount of discomfort and kind of willingness to engage in those conversations that's often missing in the kind of day-to-day of project teams and people just getting caught in a fairly comfortable space. But it does require action, and it requires the willingness to step into that space where maybe we're going to be challenged a bit and have some of our views, maybe held to task. Curious for your thoughts on that, Louise, given your comments, particularly on language towards the end of your presentation.
Yeah, look, and I'm right with you on the, what the hell interest. There's so much bound up in property, for example, that is kind of nuts, when you sit back and look at it. And I think for us, I mean, particularly in a space of working with Aboriginal communities, on ancestral lands, to use a Western legal system to find a way to make that relationship seem valid in the eyes of the state. I mean, it's a really it's an incredibly complex space to be working in, and all of us are carrying coloniality within us and the tropes of modernity. So it's as much as possible just having dialogue and unpacking, well, what are we trying to achieve? What can we use to do that? And hoping that each time something is done, it just pushes the thinking and the dialogue on that little bit further, so it can build and it can help undo the coloniality as it goes, because it's there's sort of there's been arguments around, well, we can't use property to do this because property is illegitimate. And it's like, yes, but it's here. it's what we've got. So how do we engage with that and start changing that? And trying to understand these tools in context of terms of, well, what's generated, where have they come from? But then how do we unpack them? How do we get them to serve the purposes that we've decided we need, with a very clear articulation of who we are when that is said as well? And just keeping that dialogue open and focusing on things like the role of language to help to just shake some of these these sort of rusted on concepts a little bit loose, and open them up a bit in terms of, well, what are they doing? What use are they? What purpose are they serving? And how can we tweak them to get them to do better? Hopefully, to then set the groundwork for things to do things even better. So it's just, stepping into that space and sitting with it and working with it.
And Margaret, I'm curious for your reflections on all that.
Wow. Well, we've got a lot of good things going on over here in Canada and in BC particular. But, I was doing a conference about a year ago, and we were talking about reconciliation, and it was my real epiphany on how I really don't like the word reconciliation anymore, because it becomes a trite term that, government will use when they say, as I said in my presentation, they'll use it for their excuse for hiring Indigenous or Black or people of color. And then they will still do things the way they were constitutionally structured to do things. And then just say, but I asked that Native guy over there to feed into this for me, or I asked that Black woman to tell me about, the Black history. but yet they still carry forward. And so, when I think about decolonizing, as Luis had just said, there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen for sure. And just to share something with you, we haven't published it yet. We just concluded a report here in British Columbia on municipalities and their commitment to, whether it's called reconciliation or decolonization. I prefer to do decolonization. We found that 9% of all municipalities in British Columbia have any documents that explicitly acknowledge their colonial system and the displacement of Indigenous peoples. Yet 56% of all of the municipalities have internal documents expressing a commitment to. So it really does come down to this concept of action. And I'm going to say, Ben, I really appreciated your opening. I've had a number of friends that, they get mocked, they get teased because they'll open up similarly on any forum, whether it's in a school, whether it's in a formal structure like this, or whether they're just going out to play softball or golf and there's an introduction. They introduce themselves as coming from a colonial construct, and I am trying to decolonize my mind. And that's whether they're talking to Indigenous, whether they're talking to Black, they don't care. They're just acknowledging their base foundation comes from a colonial construct. And so I think that those actions will eventually go to Yin's concepts about needing to decolonize our minds in terms of the sense of ownership. And that comes to land as well. So I can go on, but my feathers might pop up.
No, that's really interesting and really helpful. And I find it's interesting that so often the idea of decolonizing is talked about as something that's done to other people, something that we go and we decolonize a system outside of ourselves, as opposed to, or even concepts of self-determination. Even those trying to engage in co-design practice or these sorts of things, they try to co-design onto others to give them self-determination in some way, as opposed to, there's the quote that has been bandied about for years from a group of Queensland Aboriginal activists, that if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, let us work together. And that experience for me of going through that document, I've worked hard and tried to be very conscious about how I relate to the system of colonial oppression and how it works through me. And yet still, I clumsily use this language in a way that I didn't get a choice in, I didn't have a say in. And it was only after it was pointed out to me that I realized that. So it feels to me like there's almost a need for people engaged in this space, one, to realize that they're not decolonizing for the benefit of people worse off than them, but they're doing it as much out of an act of self-determination for themselves as anything else. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And also, it seems to me like there almost needs to be this kind of righteous anger associated with that we ourselves are being done to by these systems. Louise, you talked a lot about some of those structures, and even in the built environment, whether it's project management approaches or the ways that we value or measure value creation on projects. All of these tools are products of that system of colonialism and keep us oppressed as individuals. So I'm just curious, just kind of rambling there, but curious to hear your reflections on that, particularly maybe with reference to what people can do that are working within the housing system now to start to transition and shift that, whether that's picking up new tools, using new language, whatever it happens to be. But what can people listening today do tangibly? Margaret, do you want to kick us off with that one?
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest things that we're pushing for, not only here in British Columbia, and, ideally you would think that we would have a better chance to succeed in British Columbia than we would at a national scale across Canada, because we have a good working history with the province of BC. But again, despite the good people and the good leaders that are in the Crown Corporation BC Housing, that are in the government, the Minister of Housing, they still are stuck in that cyclical thinking of colonialism, which is, we will tell you how you're going to do better for yourself, rather than letting us sit at the table and tell them how we're going to do better for ourselves. And so, what we're asking, and we're actually getting some good support and good, I guess maybe for me, it's almost the end of my day, so my mind is getting tired. I'm trying to think of the word to use, but essentially we're getting some buy-in across the spectrum, whether you're Indigenous, Black, people of color, or not, in the concept of saying, we're not going to have a conversation about transformative change of any kind without Indigenous leaders being here at the table. And it's even that slow. I have tremendous partners across the housing sector, and great concepts will come in, like one that I just heard about today about sectoral transformation in terms of housing development from a green perspective. So energy efficiency, land preservation, gas emissions, all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, who's your Indigenous rep at that table? Oh, well, you know, Margaret, how these things happen. You know, partner A was talking with the government, partner B was talking with the government, and now the government thinks that the three of them will go do this. And I say, that's great. But somebody in there should have said, full stop, without an Indigenous representation, we're not even going to engage in this conversation. So we're pushing for that. It's getting there, but it is slow.
Thank you, Margaret. Yin?
I think that there's a lot of things we can do to, at various levels, from advocacy to governments, in terms of the many rules and regulations of the colonial state. In the state where I live, let's call it the province of Victoria. I like province better. We have a lot of laws that stop you from engaging in cooperative community housing. I mean, it's very hard to do so. I mean, it's not set up. It's a system that's set up for individual private housing, and increasingly people are living alone in their own houses, owning or renting, mostly renting because of house prices around here. It's just not a community. It's not a way of living. It's not a communal way of living. You know, we need more cooperatives. We need more co-housing, and we need the colonial state to move aside to let us do that, basically. You know, and it's not exactly getting back to linear progress and improvement over time, which is an interesting myth of modernity. Things have just been getting worse. Do you know, who can guess what percentage of people in the United Kingdom lived in public housing in 1979? Give me a number.
I don't know, 30%?
Almost 50%.
Wow.
Yeah. And now look what's happened. Public housing should be everywhere. You know, that should be the majority of where we live. The other thing that I'd like to say about housing is that housing is about this hour of belonging that Margaret talked about. It's about, it gives you a chance to be in community, to connect with local neighbours. And one of the worst things about neoliberal capitalism is its dislocating function, it's dislocating power. So here's another one. How many times on average does how many times in their life does the average American person from the United States move in their life? Give me a number.
3.
11.
Oh.
11 times. Now, in my field of work, people think it's normal to uproot. Oh, you want a job in academia? Here's a job in Canada. Here's a job in the US. Here's a job in the United Kingdom. Just up and go. You know, if you want a job, up and go. It's not good enough. That is not a way to live. People need to have routes from which they can travel comfortably, safely. It's just not good enough.
Thanks for sharing, Ian. I'd actually love if we had longer to keep chatting about your thoughts on public housing, because some of my work in Aotearoa at the moment, I'm finding a tension between the government's desire to basically plug ahead with public housing, which may be similar now with the recent announcement in Victoria, and self-determined outcomes that are in partnership with community, where they have more access to cooperative ownership structures. Feels like there's a tension there that's worth exploring. But Louise, I'm going to give you the final say on this before we start to wrap up. I'm very curious for your thoughts, given your work around systems and processes and what people can practically do.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a sort of growing groundswell for people, wanting to move into things like cooperatives and co-housing and intentional communities. And I think making the state aware of that, and that people want things like public housing, but also cooperatives and co-housing. But I was thinking about the role of language and this narrative around modernity and progress and speculation, and the way that the federal government in particular keeps trying to appeal to an imagined audience that is really self-interested and wants tax cuts and all of these things, when poll after poll after poll shows us that what people want is action on climate change, meaningful dialogue with First Nations, all the things that we know need to happen. And so I was wondering whether we need to set up something like an organisation called Concerned Taxpayers and speak back to the feds saying, actually, what we want is this, public education, public housing, action on climate change. So when just debunk their idea of who it is they're talking to start to change that narrative. The citizen that they think exists, who's this kind of, psychotic Homo economicus, it's a dinosaur. It doesn't exist. It's a pathological persona, and just standing up and saying, excuse me, we're over here. And these are the things we want as taxpayers because we employ you. And this is what we want to see as the future of, the multiple nations that are on this continent. So that's been my latest pet thought. So if I get the last word, that's what I'm going to share.
A good last word. So anyone listening, if you feel like going on and getting the domain name, concernedtaxpayer.org.au, let us know. I think we're all on board. Just in closing, just want to say thank you again to Louise, Yin and Margaret for taking the time to come and share, and just also to do the work that you do. It's in service to all of us, and it's been a great privilege and humbling to be able to be part of this conversation today. So thank you all, and Claire, back to you.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, Ben, for facilitating the discussion so well. And thank you to all of our speakers, and Louise, I'm in for the website and the group, and I think there's so much that everyone will have taken from today as we all embark on our decolonising journeys. I can't thank you enough, honestly, for sharing. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us from overseas, and you, Ben. And we do have another event in 2 weeks' time, which is focusing on resilient housing in the face of some of the climate challenges that we are looking at. Can't thank you all enough, and it's 9 o'clock, spot on, so we will leave there. Thank you all.